For centuries, we believed stories that were never true taught in schools whispered in. Textbooks repeated so often they became facts, we believed them. We passed them on, but tonight we go back not to the version we were taught, but to the version that was buried. Chapter 1, Ancient People Die by 30. It sounds bleak, doesn't it, the idea that for most of human history, people barely made it out of their 20s, that life in the ancient world was so short, so nasty and brutish that turning 30 was practically a miracle. It's the kind of thing we repeat without thinking, the kind of fact that floats around in casual conversation. Documentaries, even classrooms, ancient people die by 30 period. But here's the thing. That's not quite the truth, or rather it's a half-truth hiding behind a number that needs serious unpacking. Let's start with that number. Life expectancy at birth in ancient Rome was around 30 years. You'll find that figure quoted all over the place. But what it actually means isn't that everyone dropped dead before their 31st birthday. It means that when you average in all the deaths that happen at birth and infancy and in early childhood, and there were a lot of them, the overall average comes down way down. Imagine this, you're looking at a small village in 2000 BCE. 50 people lived there. 20 of them died before age 5 from infections, malnutrition, complications at birth, or just plain bad luck. But the other 30, many of them are still around in their 50s, even 60s. Maybe a few are pushing 70 if they've been both lucky and careful. The average life expectancy might still land somewhere around 30, but the lived reality vary. Different. High infant mortality pulls the average down like a stone in some regions and eras. Up to a third of children didn't survive past their first birthday, and in others that number was even higher. A child who made it to 5 had already dodged more bullets than most of us. Will in a lifetime survive that gauntlet, and your odds of seeing gray hair went up dramatically. We know this not just from texts, but from bones archaeology gives us a clearer picture than ancient writing ever could. Roman cemeteries, Egyptian tombs, Greek urn burials, even Neolithic grave sites, they show a mix of ages. Yes, there are plenty of tiny skeletons, a sobering reminder of how dangerous childhood was, but there are also adult remains, showing signs of long-term wear-borne joints, heel fractures, dental decay, arthritis. These are the bodies of people who live long lives, hard lives, maybe but not short ones. Take ancient Egypt, for example. Royal mummies, like that of Ramses II, who lived to around 90, tend to skew the perception. Pharaohs had access to better nutrition, protection from violence, and some of the earliest forms of medical care. But even among non-elites, people lived in the middle and old age workers on state-sponsored projects, like those who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, often show signs of long careers, chronic injuries, and stress. Markers on their bones suggest decades of labor. You don't get that from people dying at 29. Greece and Rome tell similar stories. In Athens, men in their 40s and 50s held public office, taught philosophy, or led armies, and Rome senators were often well into their 60s. Cato, the elder, wrote a farming manual in his 80s. Pliny, the elder, wasn't exactly young when he died, investigating Mount Vesuvius, and that was more about bad luck than bad health. And while the elite classes left behind the most writings, their lives weren't totally unrelatable. They still lived in environments without antibiotics, without vaccines, without modern surgery. Their survival wasn't just due to privilege. It also shows us that under the right conditions, humans have always had the potential for longer lives. The capacity was there, even if the dangers were much greater. That's not to romanticize it. Life was precarious. A simple infection could kill. A broken bone might never heal properly. A drought, a war, a poor harvest, any of these could shift the odds overnight. Sanitation varied wildly from place to place in Mesopotamian cities. For instance, sewage and drinking water often ran disturbingly close together. In ancient Rome, aqueducts brought fresh water, but public latrines and baths were communal spaces ripe for the spread of disease. Still, even in the face of these risks, people adapted. They learned which herbs could reduce fevers or settle a stomach. They understood enough about diet to recognize the dangers of scurvy or starvation. They developed systems of care, midwives, healers, even rudimentary surgeons that, while primitive by today's Standards often made the difference between life and death. Culture mattered too in some societies. The elderly were revered, not just tolerated, but honored in others. Aging might mean vulnerability or marginalization, but either way, the fact that there were elders at all challenges the notion of universal early death. The ancient world had grandparents. It had matriarchs and patriarchs, village elders, and seasoned warriors. You don't get those without people living long enough to earn the title. So how did we end up so fixated on 30? Part of it is our modern relationship with data. We like clean numbers, we like averages, but an average is not a destiny. It's a mathematical expression, not a story. And in the case of ancient life expectancy, it tells a story about risk, not inevitability. Another part is how we define a normal lifespan today in the developed world. It's not unusual to see people hitting 80, 90, even 100. So 30 sounds like the edge of a cliff, but if we take a step back, even our modern numbers are still pulled down by early deaths. A child born today in some parts of the world may still face high mortality risk from malnutrition or disease. Take away those early tragedies, and life expectancy numbers jump fast. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine two people in an ancient town. One dies at birth, the other lives to 70. The average between them is 35. But that tells you nothing about the 70-year-old's actual experience of full life rich with seasons and stories. It just tells you how dangerous being born was. When we hear people die by 30, we often imagine a world of constant loss where no one got to grow old, where wisdom had no time to gather. But that's not the world ancient people lived in. They buried children, yes, often, but they also raised them, mentored them, passed on skills and stories. They built communities where age had meaning, not just limitation. And this matters because how we imagine the past shapes how we think about progress. If we believe history was just a dark corridor of short, brutal lives, then everything modern looks like a shining rescue. But the truth is more nuanced. Humans have always fought for survival and often won. We've always found ways to live longer, to pass on knowledge, to care for one another, not always perfectly, not everywhere equally, but enough to prove that 30 was never a finish line. So no ancient people didn't all die by 30. Some did, many didn't. The numbers don't tell the whole story, but the bones, the text, the evidence, they speak. And they say that life, even in the ancient world, was long enough to matter, because this isn't just about numbers. It's about imagination, about how we see the people who came before us, not as ghosts trapped in a tragic past, but as full human beings living, aging, striving, enduring. And if we can see that clearly, then we're ready to question the next myth. 2, Chapter 2, The Great Fire of London Ended the Plague. It's a neat story, too neat. In 1665, London is gripped by the Great Plague, bodies piling up, red crosses on doors, the sound of death carts rolling through narrow lanes. Then just 1 year later, in 1666, fire breaks out in a bakery on Pudding Lane. It rages for 4 days, consuming much of the old medieval city, and with it, so the story goes, the rats and fleas that carried the plague are burned to ash. London is cleansed. The plague ends. The fire, we're told, was a brutal blessing, but history rarely works in straight lines. The Great Fire of London didn't end the plague. In truth, by the time the first sparks hit the thatched rooftops and timber buildings, the worst of the epidemic was already behind the city. The idea that flames rid London of disease sounds compelling. It's tidy. It feels symbolic, but it simply doesn't hold up under scrutiny. To understand why this myth persists and what really happened, we need to picture the London of the 1660s. It was a city teetering between worlds, a patchwork of cramped medieval alleys and emerging modern institutions. There were no real street numbers, no sewer systems in the way we think of them, and most of the buildings were packed tightly, leaning in over crooked lanes. Timber, pitch, and straw made fire not just a danger, but an inevitability. The town was still the main artery for trade and goods, along where people and pests flowed in constantly. When plague arrived in 1665, it wasn't a new terror. London had seen its kind before. Bubonic plague, carried by fleas, often hosted on black rats, had haunted Europe since the 14th century. But this outbreak hit hard in the summer of 1665. Deaths surged, the bills of mortality, weekly public death tallies began, recording numbers that sent people fleeing. Whole parishes were hollowed out. The poor, living in overcrowded tenements outside the old city walls, bore the brunt. Quarantine measures were patchy at best. Authorities nailed doors shut, marking the sick with a red cross and the grim phrase, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Watchmen were posted outside. Families were locked inside to suffer or survive together. And yet, even as panic spread, the plague was already on its own natural timeline. Like most plague outbreaks, it was seasonal. Warmer months brought higher infection rates. Fleas were more active by the winter of 1665. Deaths were declining fast by the early months of 1666. The outbreak had largely passed, not because of human intervention, not because of divine mercy, but because the fleas and the bacteria they carried couldn't sustain themselves in cold weather and a thinned-out host population. It was ebbing on its own. Then came September. The fire started in a bakery and quickly turned into an inferno. Flames tore through the commercial heart of the city. Cheapside, Lombard Street, the Royal Exchange Street, Paul's Cathedral, still under construction, collapsed in the heat. Over 13,000 buildings were destroyed, but crucially, the fire didn't reach the neighborhoods that had been hit hardest by the plague. The worst of the epidemic had unfolded in the suburbs, the outer parishes like Stepney and Clerkenwell, where poverty and density were highest. The fire, by contrast, tore through the old world city, the center of trade, wealth, and government. Many of the plague's worst battlegrounds were left untouched by the flames. So why do we still hear that the fire ended the plague? Partly, it's the human desire for a clean ending. The plague was terrifying. It disrupted not just bodies, but social order, commerce, belief, when something as catastrophic as a fire followed so closely after. It was tempting to link them, to see the fire as a kind of purification, a final act that closed the chapter on death and fear, helped people make sense of the chaos. It also gave people something visible. The credit disease is invisible. Insidious fire, on the other hand, is immediate, tangible, unforgettable. You can see it, you can imagine it, scouring the rats and fleas from the city. The image is powerful, even if it's misleading. Contemporary writers hinted at the idea, too, in the decades after. Memoirs and chronicles often linked the two events, not always directly, but suggestively. Over time, the connection stuck, and once a narrative has roots, especially one that feels redemptive, it's hard to shake loose. But what really helped stop the plague? The answer, as usual, isn't simple. Quarantine efforts, while inconsistent, weren't useless. Ships were held at ports. People were sometimes isolated. Local authorities tried, often desperately, to slow the spread. The wealthy fled to country estates, reducing transmission in the city's core. Plague doctors, famously dressed in bird-like masks, may have looked theatrical to us now, but they were part of a broader attempt to professionalize public health. Some parishes enforced the closure of public gatherings, plays, and ale houses. The overall effect was patchy, but not insignificant. Then there was nature plague. Outbreaks often burn themselves out, especially when they kill quickly and broadly. The disease doesn't thrive in low-density environments. Cold weather helped too. The bitter winter of 1665 to 1666 likely did more to freeze the epidemic than any man-made effort. Sanitation, or the lack thereof, also played a role. London was dirty, filthy by today's standards, but not evenly so. The poorest areas, with their open cesspits and overfilled housing, suffered most. The fire didn't reach these places, and afterward rebuilding was slow. There was no sudden urban transformation. The new buildings were somewhat more fire-resistant, brick and stone instead of timber, but sewage still ran through the streets. Rats didn't vanish, neither did fleas. What did change over time was immunity. Some people survived the plague, and survivors often developed resistance, combined with better quarantine practices and the natural cycles of the disease. The conditions for a repeat outbreak just didn't align the same way. Again, modern historians, using parish records, death bills, and archaeological data, have built a clearer picture. They've charted where the plague struck hardest and where the fire burned. The two rarely overlap. They've analyzed the bacterial strains responsible Yenia pestis, and examined the rodents involved, and there's growing evidence that the role of rats has been overstated in some outbreaks. Human fleas and lice may have done more damage than rats ever did. Again, complexity replaces myth. So the story that the fire wiped out the disease by burning away vermin, it's tidy, it's satisfying, but it misses the messier, more interesting truth. What's more, it reveals something about how we use stories to cope with crisis. We want to believe that catastrophe has a purpose, that horror leads to healing, that destruction is followed by rebirth. Sometimes it is, but sometimes events just collide. A plague ends, a fire starts, and our minds reach for patterns. In the end, the Great Fire didn't end the plague. The plague ended on its own terms. The fire destroyed much, but it didn't burn the disease away. And yet the myth persists because it gives us closure. It wraps terror in a bow. But when we unwrap it, what we find is more complicated and more human, because history doesn't always need to be poetic to be powerful. Sometimes it's enough to understand what really happened and why we kept telling ourselves a different story. Chapter 3, Salem Witches. We're all women. We tend to picture the Salem witch trials with a certain cast of characters in mind. Women always. Women in aprons and bonnets surrounded by Puritan judges and pointing fingers. The myth has a stubborn grip that the hysteria that tore through Salem in 1692 targeted women exclusively, that being female was the fatal flaw. But that's not quite how it happened. The truth is more complicated, more unsettling, and more revealing of how fear warps communities. Yes, most of those accused were women, but men weren't safe husbands. Ministers, farmers, some were hanged, one was crushed to death by stones, and many others spent months in jail, their lives upended not by spells or omens, but by neighborly suspicion. In a court system that had lost its footing, the Salem witch trials unfolded in a pocket of Massachusetts Bay Colony that was small, tense, and deeply religious. Puritanism wasn't just a faith, it was a full blueprint for life, and that blueprint was cracking under pressure. By the 1690s, Salem and surrounding villages were dealing with political instability, war on the frontier, smallpox outbreaks, and bitter internal disputes over land and leadership. In that setting, the idea that invisible evil was creeping through the town wasn't far-fetched. It was a terrifying answer to a list of problems no one could seem to solve. The first accusation started with a group of girls, children really, who claimed to be afflicted by witches. They convulsed, screamed, claimed to see specters. They named names, and the adults listened. It began with enslaved women like Tit, and then spread quickly to others. Sarah, good Sarah, Osborne, all women on the margins. But within weeks, men were being accused too. One of the first was George Burroughs, a former minister in Salem Village. He had been in a long-standing feud with local leaders when he was accused of being the witches' ringleader. The charges weren't about his gender. They were about power, influence. Old grudges dressed up as Justice Burroughs was arrested, tried, and ultimately hanged right before the noose tightened. He recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, something the court had insisted a real witch couldn't do. It should have cast out. It didn't. Another man, John Proctor, was a tavern keeper, outspoken, skeptical, not easily intimidated. When his wife Elizabeth was accused, he publicly criticized the trials. That was enough to make him a target. He was arrested, tried, and executed. His last words were a prayer. Like many others, his sons and servants testified on his behalf. It didn't save him. And then there was Giles Corey. Corey wasn't a saint. He had a rough past, accused of theft, involved in the beating death of a farmhand years before. But by 1692, he was in his 70s, a landowner, and stubbornly independent. When his wife Martha was accused of witchcraft, he defended her. Soon he too was accused, but when he was brought before the court, he refused to enter a plea, neither guilty nor not guilty. Under English law, without a plea, the court couldn't try him, so they pressed him. It was a rare and brutal punishment. Even then, they laid Corey on the ground, placed a wooden board on his chest, and stacked stones on top, slowly, deliberately. Over days, the goal was to force a plea. He never gave one. According to some accounts, his final words were simply, "More weight." Whether that quote is literal or not, the fact remains he was crushed to death by the system itself. not because he was a woman, because he resisted. In total, 5 men were executed during the Salem trials. Alongside 14 women, others were imprisoned, many for months. Some died in custody. The records show male and female prisoners ranging in age from children to the elderly. The net cast by the hysteria didn't stop at gender. It raped around anyone who was seen as troublesome, inconvenient, or unlucky. So why do we remember it as a women's story? Partly it's because the figure of the witch is so deeply coded as female in Western imagination. For centuries, women have been associated with the supernatural, with temptation, mystery, danger. The image of the witch carries centuries of cultural baggage, from the biblical Eve to the European witch hunts that predated Salem. By decades, those hunts killed tens of thousands, mostly women. So by the time the trials reach New England, the narrative was already written in the collective mind. And yes, misogyny played a role. Many of the women accused were poor, outspoken, widowed, or otherwise outside the narrow bounds of what a proper woman should be. They were vulnerable, and in a patriarchal society, stepping out of place even slightly could mark someone as dangerous. But it wasn't only gender. The Salem panic was fed by layers of tension: land disputes, family rivalries, class divides, religious factionalism. Personal grievances wore the mask of moral crusade. If you had enemies, you were at risk. If you questioned the court, you were suspect. If you stayed silent, it could still be enough. In a system driven by spectral evidence, visions, dreams, invisible wounds, no one was untouchable. The trials ended as abruptly as they began. By late 1692, the public began to lose faith too. Many respectable people had been swept up. Too many inconsistencies piled up. Governor William Phipps stepped in, halting the executions and eventually disbanding the court. Later, some of the judges publicly repented. The colony declared a day of fasting and soul-searching. But the damage was done. The legacy of Salem became a kind of cautionary tale. But over time, it narrowed. The figure of the female witch took center stage in London. In books and movies and Halloween costumes, it made for a compelling symbol. Women crushed by patriarchy, punished for their power, their knowledge, their independence. That story isn't false, but it's only part of the truth. The fuller picture is more complex, and in some ways, more disturbing. Salem was a case study in how fear, once unleashed, doesn't discriminate cleanly. It follows fault lines, yes, but it also leaps them. It punishes the vulnerable, but it can also consume the powerful, and often it thrives not because of one evil person, but because of many small decisions made under pressure, decisions fueled by fear or ambition, or the desperate need to feel safe. In the end, the myth that only women were accused flattens what really happened. It turns a communal collapse into a single note tragedy. But the records are clear. Men were caught in the fire too. They died not because they were witches, and not just because they were men, but because the society around them couldn't hold itself together. That's the part worth remembering, that when panic spreads and doubt takes root, justice becomes slippery, and the targets, they're rarely as simple as the stories we tell afterward. Chapter 4: Samurai were always noble and loyal. The image is hard to shake alone. Figure sword at his side, standing against the wind. He lives by an unshakable code, devoted to honor, to duty, to death. If necessary, he is the samurai, stoic, loyal, incorruptible. It's a powerful myth, and like most powerful myths, it's only partly true. The idea that all samurai lived and died by a strict moral code known as Bushido, a kind of Japanese chivalry, is one of the most enduring fantasies in global history, but the reality is far more complicated. During their prime, the samurai class was anything but a monolith of moral discipline. They were warriors, yes, but also landlords, mercenaries, administrators, and political players. Many were fiercely loyal to their clan until they weren't. Others rose to power through violence, betrayal, and calculated ambition. The romantic version of the samurai wasn't something they lived by. It was something later generations wrote down. To understand where this myth came from, we have to understand when it didn't exist. During the Sengoku period, roughly the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries, Japan was fractured. It was an age of near constant civil war, where powerful clans battled for dominance, and alliances shifted like the tide. In that environment, survival mattered more than philosophy. Samurai fought for lords who could feed and pay them. Loyalty was conditional. Honor was often a matter of convenience. One of the most striking examples comes from the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, a decisive conflict that helped unify Japan under Tokugawa Ieyasu. Many samurai switched sides during the battle. Some in the middle of combat, the outcome hinged not just on strategy or courage, but on calculated betrayals, and yet many of these same figures would later be celebrated as paragons of the samurai ideal. Their actions were remembered not for their disloyalty, but for their role in shaping the nation. Even among the most famous names, the crack show Taida Shingen, Wugi Kenshin, Oda Nobunaga, legendary warlords, were all ruthless in their pursuit of power. Nobunaga, in particular, was known for brutal tactics, including the mass burning of Buddhist temples whose monks had sided with his enemies. These weren't lapses in a sacred code. This was the code when expand dominate in the real-world strategy came first. It's not that samurai had no values. Many followed clan codes of conduct, personal ethics shaped by Confucianism, Buddhism, or their own interpretations of service, but these weren't uniform, and they certainly weren't the universal rulebooks later claimed. They were the concept of Bushido. Literally, the way of the warrior wasn't even widely used until the peaceful Edo period. After the fighting had stopped by the early 1600s, Japan was unified. Tokugawa rule brought stability, peace, and a problem for the warrior class. With no more wars to fight, the samurai had to adapt. Many became bureaucrats, tax collectors, teachers, or ceremonial guards. Their swords became symbols more than tools. In this context, Bushido began to take shape not as a lived practice, but as a moral framework. It was less about how samurai actually behaved and more about how they were expected to behave now that they no longer had battles to prove themselves. Writers like Yamagata and later Inazo Nito helped codify this ideal, blending Confucian virtue, Buddhist detachment, and Shinto loyalty into a kind of warrior philosophy. Nito's book Bushido, The Soul of Japan, written in English in 1899, played a huge role in exploring the idea of the noble samurai to Western audiences, but it was a selective retelling, one that skipped over centuries of backstabbing and pragmatism in favor of spiritual depth and moral purity. By the time Bushido was widely embraced as a national identity, the samurai class was already on its way out. The Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century abolished their privileges. Japan was modernizing, industrializing, and turning toward empire, but instead of discarding the samurai image, leaders repurposed it. The samurai became icons of Japanese spirit, discipline, and self-sacrifice, ideal models for soldiers, students, and citizens alike. That version stuck. It was reinforced in the 20th century through textbooks, films, and state propaganda. During World War II, Bushido was invoked to justify extreme loyalty to the emperor, even suicide missions after the war. Western films and pop culture picked up the torch, turning samurai into cinematic legends. Always stoic, always noble, the myth had gone global, but beneath the surface, the history remained full of contradictions. Some samurai exploited peasants, raised brutal taxes, and crushed uprisings. Others betrayed their lords or plotted coups. Still others lived relatively ordinary lives far from the battlefield. The idea of an unbroken warrior code simply doesn't match the diversity of their roles or the realities they faced. Even within the Edo period, where Bushido was supposedly in full force, adherents varied wildly. Some samurai were devout, ethical, and dutiful. Others were corrupt or careless. Some turned to poetry and scholarship. Others drank, gambled, or jeweled in the streets. There was no council handing down moral purity. Like any social class, the samurai were humans shaped by their time, their needs, and their ambitions. And yet the legend persists because it gives us something to admire. It offers clarity in a messy world, a symbol of strength and principle, and there's no shame in that. But clarity isn't the same as truth. The real samurai were not always noble and not always loyal. Some were, but many were pragmatic, ruthless, or just trying to survive. Bushido was not a timeless code etched into history. It was a story, one that evolved, solidified, and was eventually told loud enough to drown out the rest. To understand history clearly, we have to be willing to separate the ideal from the reality, not to tear down the past, but to see it honestly, because the stories we Inherent about warriors, about honor, about identity are never just about the past. They're about what we choose to believe now, and sometimes the truth is more revealing than the Legend Chapter 5, the Spanish Inquisition was all-powerful and omnipresent. The phrase alone is enough to summon a reaction, the Spanish Inquisition, even if you know almost nothing about European history. Those words carry weight. They conjure images of shadowy interrogators, redrode judges, torture chambers beneath cathedrals, and an oncoming wave of religious terror sweeping across Europe. Maybe there's a dramatic movie scene in your mind, maybe a punchline from a sketch comedy show, but whatever the source, the impression is clear. The Inquisition was vast, ruthless, and everywhere, except it wasn't. The Spanish Inquisition was real. It operated for centuries. It interrogated, punished, and yes, sometimes executed people accused of religious offenses. But it was not a roaming force that terrorized all of Europe. It wasn't a medieval Gestapo, and it wasn't omnipresent. It was, in reality, a state-run institution with a much narrower reach and purpose than the myth suggests, and understanding what it actually did requires setting aside the drama and stepping into the quieter, often stranger reality of early modern Spain. It began in 1478 under the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. This was not the medieval Inquisition, created by the Church in the 13th century, a separate entity with its own jurisdiction and focus. The Spanish Inquisition was different. It was royal, it was national, and it was political. Spain in the late 15th century had just emerged from centuries of Muslim rule in parts of the peninsula. The Reconquista had ended, the monarchy was consolidating power, and Catholicism was the unifying thread they wanted to tighten. But the focus wasn't on rooting out all non-Catholics. It was more specific. The Inquisition targeted conversos, Jews, and Muslims who had converted to Christianity, often under pressure, or to avoid expulsion, and who were suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. This was not about mass religious extermination. It was about control, suspicion, and identity in the eyes of the monarchy. These so-called new Christians posed a problem. They blended in, yet they might not be fully loyal. The Inquisition gave the state a legal mechanism to investigate and punish hidden heresy, and just as important, to send a message about who truly belonged, contrary to the image of the Inquisition as an all-powerful secret police. Its reach was bureaucratic and legalistic. Trials were formal, procedures were followed, however flawed by modern standards. There were interrogations and accusations, yes, but also witnesses' testimony records. It was not pure chaos, and while torture was used, as it was in many judicial systems at the time, it was far from constant, and regulations limited how and when it could be applied. One of the biggest myths is about the scale of violence. For centuries, estimates of the Inquisition's death toll soared into the tens or hundreds of thousands, but detailed studies of archival records tell a different story. Over its 3-century run, historians estimate that the Spanish Inquisition tried roughly 130,000 people. Of those, around 1 to 2% were executed, perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 people in total. That's horrific, yes, but it's a far cry from the industrialized terror we often imagine. To put it in perspective, secular courts in Protestant countries like England and Germany executed witches and heretics in far greater numbers during similar time periods. In fact, the Spanish Inquisition was often suspicious of popular witch hunting and discouraged mass hysteria. It preferred heresies that could be documented, tracked, and punished within a framework of doctrine. That's not to excuse the system. People were imprisoned, lives were ruined, reputations destroyed. But it's important to be clear, the Inquisition wasn't indiscriminate. It was selective, and it stayed mostly within Spain and its colonial holdings. There were Inquisitions in the New World in places like Mexico and Peru, and occasionally in Italy or the Netherlands during periods of Spanish control. But it did not operate across all of Europe. In fact, many parts of Europe saw the Spanish Inquisition more as a threat than a reality, something to warn against rather than something they experienced directly. So how did the myth grow so large? Part of it came from Spain's enemies during the Reformation. Protestant nations seized on the Inquisition as a symbol of Catholic tyranny. They circulated pamphlets, engravings, and lurid accounts of torture and Repression these depictions weren't just critiques of a legal system. They were weapons in a larger ideological war. Spain was the superpower of the 16th century, and the Inquisition became an easy emblem of its supposed backwardness, cruelty, and fanaticism. Later, Enlightenment thinkers added their voices. Philosophers like Voltaire and historians like Edward Gibbon used the Inquisition to showcase the evils of organized religion and authoritarian rule. Their criticisms weren't entirely wrong. The Inquisition did violate principles of personal freedom and conscience, but their tone helped solidify the idea of an all-devouring machine. And then came modern media, novels, films, dramas. Eventually, comedy, the image became theatrical, overblown, even absurd. Montepiton's famous sketch, "Nobody Expects the Spanish Inquisition," turned it into a punchline, but also reinforced the sense that the Inquisition was unpredictable, omnipresent, and universal. The irony is that by the time that sketch aired, the real institution had been gone for over a century. The Spanish Inquisition was officially abolished in 1834. By then, it had long since faded from power. In its later years, it spent more time monitoring books and behavior than burning heretics. It was an institution that lingered like many bureaucracies do long after its original purpose had passed. It didn't end in a burst of flame. It just stopped being useful. And that may be the most revealing part of the story. The Inquisition wasn't designed to terrorize all of Europe. It was built to serve a specific political agenda in a specific time and place. It targeted people not at random, but based on identity and suspicion. It used religion as a tool, but its deeper aim was consolidation of power, of ideology, of national unity. Over time, that narrow mission ballooned into legend because societies love villains. We love institutions that we can point to and say that was evil. It simplifies the past. It gives us someone to blame, and the more distant that past becomes, the more room we have to exaggerate. That's how the Spanish Inquisition went from a legal arm of the Spanish monarchy to a mythic engine of terror, but misflattened. They strip out the messy details, the human decisions, and the context that makes history harder, but also more interesting. The real Inquisition was cruel in ways, but not in every way. It was powerful, but not unstoppable, and its reach, while serious, was limited. If we want to learn from history, we have to be willing to see it clearly, not just as we've been told, but as it actually was, because history, like power, is always vulnerable to distortion. And sometimes the stories we inherit, especially the ones that make for good drama, are the ones we most need to double-check. Chapter 6. Christopher Columbus was the first European to reach America. For centuries, the story was told in classrooms and carved into monuments that in 1492 Christopher Columbus discovered America. He crossed the Atlantic, found a new world, and set the course of history in motion. It's a tidy narrative, bold explorer, uncharted lands, the start of something big. But like most tidy narratives, it leaves a lot out because Columbus wasn't the first European to reach the Americas, not by a long shot. Nearly 500 years before his ships left Spain, Norse sailors from Scandinavia were already exploring the far edges of the Atlantic, and one of them, a man named Leif Erikson, almost certainly set foot on the North American mainland. He didn't just sail by, he landed, stayed, and built. It didn't last. It didn't change the world, but it happened, and we know it happened. Not just from sagas or stories, but from what has been found in the ground. To understand how Leif Erikson ended up in what's now Canada, we have to look at where he came from. The Norse world of the late first millennium was no stranger to long voyages. Viking ships had already reached Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland. They weren't drifting aimlessly. They were traders, settlers, and sometimes raiders. They followed coastlines, watched the sun and stars, and used landmarks and oral maps pass down through generations. Leif's father, Eric the Red, founded a settlement in Greenland after being exiled from Iceland. From there, the next logical step west was something new, a land hinted at in tales told by sailors who had seen forested shores beyond the ice. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson set out with a crew and found that land. He called it Vinland, meaning wine land, possibly referring to wild grapes or the abundance of natural resources. What they found and where they landed is now believed to be the northern tip of Newfoundland in present-day Canada. The spot is called Lanzo Meadows, and it's not just a legend, it's a real place. And the evidence there is solid excavations in the 1960s revealed unmistakable signs of a Norse presence, turf buildings, iron nails, boat repair workshops, and tools that match those found in known Viking settlements, radiocarbon dating, and artifact analysis place the site right around the year 1,500 years. Before Columbus set sail, no other European culture left such physical evidence in the Americas that early there are plenty of fringe theories about who might have arrived first: Phoenicians, Egyptians, Chinese fleets. But those stories don't have the same weight. No archaeological proof, no confirmed written records, no consensus among serious historians. The Norse site in Newfoundland stands alone, sparse but undeniable. Still, Leif Erikson's voyage doesn't appear to have started anything lasting. The Norse may have stayed for a season, maybe a few years, but the settlements didn't take root. There was no colonization, no massive migration, no reshaping of continents. Reasons likely included distant supply problems, conflict with local indigenous groups, and the limited scale of the expedition. Greenland itself was already remote. Vinland was a step too far for sustained contact. That's part of why Columbus's journey would later dominate the story. When his ships crossed the Atlantic in 1492, they came from a different world, one prime for expansion. European powers were consolidating, exploring, and competing for resources, and territory navigation was improving, and ships were stronger, faster, better armed. There was a political appetite for empire, and Columbus's voyage arrived at just the right moment. Defeated, Columbus never actually set foot on what we now call the United States. His landfalls were in the Caribbean islands like Hispaniola and Cuba, but his voyages kicked off a wave of contact, conquest, and colonization that reshaped the globe. Spain, Portugal, later England and France, they all followed. Diseases, trade, war, and migration followed with them. The world after Columbus was not the same. Leif Erikson had found the Americas. Columbus helped connect them violently, dramatically to the rest of Europe. So why is Columbus still the one children are taught to remember? Partly, it's about legacy and narrative control. Columbus's story was promoted early, and often Spain had every reason to amplify his role as the founder of a new era. Later in the United States, his image was adopted as a national symbol, a bold explorer representing the spirit of discovery and expansion. Italian communities embraced him as a cultural icon. Columbus Day became a holiday. Monuments went up, and once a version of history is made official, it tends to stick. Leif Erikson's story, by contrast, was more muted. It came from the sagas of Iceland, long poetic narratives mixing history, myth, and memory. They weren't widely known outside Scandinavia for centuries. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that serious attention turned to the idea of Norse contact with North America. And even then, it was often framed as a curiosity, a footnote. But that's changing today. Most historians agree that Leif Erikson deserves credit as the first known European to reach North America, not in legend, in fact. The evidence is there. The history just didn't unfold in a way that left an empire in its wake. That distinction matters. Discovering a place is not the same as colonizing it. Landing on a shore is not the same as changing its future. Leif Erikson arrived. Columbus opened the floodgates. One came quietly and left little behind. The other came with the backing of a crown and changed the map of the world. Still, recognizing that Columbus wasn't first doesn't take away from the scale of what followed. It adds to our understanding. It reminds us that history is not a single thread, but a web. That there were paths taken and paths abandoned. That contact between peoples didn't begin with a flag in the sand. It also forces us to rethink what discovery really means. The land was never empty. Indigenous nations had lived in the Americas for tens of thousands of years. They had civilizations, trade routes, languages, laws. To discover a place already inhabited is to impose a certain view of history, one that erases who was there first and what was already known. Correcting the Columbus myth doesn't erase him. It situates him. It puts his voyage in context, not as the starting point of history, but as one turning point among many. It also gives us a fuller picture of how knowledge is shaped by politics, by storytelling, by whose voice is loudest in the end. Remembering Leif Erikson doesn't just shift the timeline, it shifts the perspective it shows. You said the world was being explored, mapped, and imagined in ways that didn't always lead to conquest, and that not all history begins with a flag and a claim. Sometimes it begins with a quiet landing, a campfire in the wind, and a place remembered not for what it started, but for what it proved was possible. Chapter 7, Isaac. Newton discovered gravity by getting hit with an apple. It's one of the most famous stories in science. Isaac Newton, sitting under a tree, minding his own business, when bonk, an apple drops onto his head. And in that exact moment, the mystery of gravity is solved. The planets, the tides, the falling of every object on Earth. Explain all thanks to a bit of bruised fruit. It's charming, it's memorable, and it's not. How it happened, the truth behind Newton's discovery of gravity, is much less cinematic, but far more extraordinary, because what Newton actually did wasn't a flash of inspiration sparked by fallen produce. It was years of solitary work, slow, methodical, sometimes obsessive thought, combined with a deep grasp of mathematics, observation, and the scientific legacy of those who came before him. The apple may have played a role, but not the one the myth suggests. In 1665, Isaac Newton was a young man, just 22, when the Great Plague swept through England. Like many others, he left the city of Cambridge and returned to his family's estate in Woolsthorpe, a quiet countryside far from the outbreak. This wasn't just a temporary break. Cambridge closed entirely, and for nearly 2 years, Newton lived in isolation, far from being idle. This period would later be called Newton's Annus Mirabilis, his year of wonders. It wasn't marked by one eureka moment, but by a storm of thought. In that time, Newton began developing what would become calculus. He explored optics and light, and he started laying the foundation for what we now call the laws of motion and universal gravitation. So where does the apple come in, according to Newton himself much later in life? He had indeed seen an apple fall from a tree. The moment gave him pause, not because it hit him, but because he began wondering why the apple always fell straight down, not sideways, not upward, but toward the Earth's center. What force guided it? And could that same force extend farther than the apple, perhaps to the moon or the planets? That idea that the same force pulling an apple to the ground might also keep the moon in orbit was radical. It unified the physics of Earth with the movements of the heavens. Until then, the motion of the stars and the motion of everyday objects were treated as two separate domains. Newton's genius was to show that they were governed by the same laws, but this was not a single leap. Newton wrestled with the mathematics. He returned to ideas from Galileo, who had described acceleration and inertia, and Kepler, whose laws describe how planets moved in ellipses. Newton didn't discard their work, he built on it. He asked a question few had seriously attempted to answer: what force makes a planet curve through space? Instead of shooting off in a straight line, the answer was gravity. But not just as a name, Newton gave it structure. He showed that every object in the universe attracts every other object with a force that depends on their masses and the square of the distance between them. That simple equation could explain the fall of an apple, the swing of a pendulum, the orbit of the moon, and the motion of comets. And it wasn't guesswork. It was mathematics, clean and testable. Newton didn't publish this work right away. He held on to it for decades, refining it in private. It wasn't until the 1680s, almost 20 years after his retreat to Woolsthorpe, that Newton was prompted to pull it all together. The result was philosophy and naturalized Principia Mathematica, often just called the Principia, published in 1687. It's one of the most important scientific books ever written. It didn't just describe gravity, it laid out the laws of motion that still underpin physics today. And yet, despite all that, the apple story stuck. Why? Part of it is due to Voltaire writing in the 18th century. He helped spread the tale, saying he had heard it from Newton's niece. Voltaire loved a good story, and the image of the apple was perfect, clean, symbolic, easy to remember. Over time, the details shifted from Newton watching an apple fall to it striking him on the head. The moment of insight became physical, almost comedic. It wasn't enough for Newton to wonder he had to be hit. The story worked because it compressed a lifetime of thought into a single digestible moment. We like our geniuses sudden and inspired, a flash of light, a bolt from the blue, but real discovery doesn't Look like that, it looks like Newton, isolated, uncertain, spending months refining a problem that started with a falling apple and ended with the moon. And what's often forgotten is that Newton himself was a deeply complex figure. Brilliant, yes, but also secretive, combative, and sometimes petty in his rivalries. He guarded his ideas closely and waged bitter intellectual battles over credit, but he also had a mind capable of imagining the universe. Not as a mystery, but as a machine vast, ordered, and knowable. That's what made gravity revolutionary. It didn't just explain one apple or one orbit. It redefined our relationship to the cosmos. The Earth was no longer the center of everything, and motion was no longer just the domain of gods or chance. It was law, predictable, mathematical, universal. The apple myth persists because it simplifies genius. It gives us a neat origin story, but in doing so, it erases the process, the false starts, the borrowed ideas, the patient observation. The years of scribbled calculations. The real Newton didn't find gravity. He defined it, and that's far more impressive than being hit on the head in the end. Stories like this tell us something about how we remember history. We prefer tidy beginnings, clear causes, single names, but science doesn't unfold that way. It's a relay, not a solo sprint, Newton himself said. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. He meant it. Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, all played their part. The apple, if it fell at all, was just the beginning of a much longer fall toward understanding. And maybe that's the better story, not of a lone man struck by fate, but of a mind that took a simple question and followed it as far as it would go, past the clouds, past the moon, all the way to the stars. Chapter 8. The Minoans were peaceful, matriarchal, and nonviolent for more than a century. The Minoan civilization has occupied a special place in the modern imagination, somewhere between history and fantasy. It's often portrayed as a kind of Bronze Age Eden, peaceful, artistic, ruled by women, devoted to goddess worship, and untouched by war or conquest, a society where palaces were playgrounds for culture, not centers of power, where bulls let flowers bloom and violence never took root. But like most idealized stories about the ancient world, this version of Minoan creed says as much about us as it does about them. The myth of a peaceful, matriarchal Minoan utopia begins with one man, Arthur Evans. In the early 1900s, Evans began excavating the ruins of Nuz-on, the island of Crete. What he uncovered was dazzling, vast palace complexes with elaborate fresco, delicate pottery, and complex architectural layouts that seemed to suggest wealth and sophistication, but no clear signs of fortification or organized warfare to Evans. This was something different, something gentler than the warden ruins of Mycenaean Greece or Hittite Anatolia. Evans was a product of his time. He brought Victorian and Edwardian ideas with him into the dirt. And when he saw images of women in flowing garments, depictions of goddesses and ceremonial bulls instead of swords, he filled in the blanks with his own vision of a lost world ruled by art and intuition rather than power and violence. He interpreted Konos as the capital of a great but gentle civilization. He even coined the term Minoan, linking the culture to the mythic king Minos, though we have no idea what they called themselves. Evans wasn't just excavating ruins. He was building a narrative, and that narrative stuck for decades. The Minoans were cast as the spiritual opposite of the warlike Mycenaeans who came after them, where the Mycenaeans built citadels and left behind records of conquest. The Minoans were said to be matronal, egalitarian, peace-loving. Their religion was thought to center around a mother goddess, attended by priestesses and female figures of power. Modern readers, especially during waves of feminist revival in the 20th century, embraced this image. The Minoans became a symbol of what might have been a prehistoric society, free from patriarchy and violence. But archaeology has a way of complicating stories over time. The evidence told a different tale. Yes, Minoan art is striking, colorful fresco, showing marine life, festivals, and acrobatics, but alongside those images are other scenes of weapons of hunting, of ritual sacrifice. Bronze swords, daggers, and armor have been found in Minoan contexts. Elite burials contain not only luxury goods, but tools of war and control. The palatial centers, Konos, Fistos, Malia, weren't just playgrounds of aesthetics. They were administrative hubs with storerooms, archives, and centralized control. Over goods and labor, the so-called palaces were likely the seats of ruling elites who coordinated trade, tax production, and managed large workforces. That suggests hierarchy, not equality. And while women do appear prominently in Minoan art, so do men, especially in roles linked to ceremony authority and athletic prowess, the presence of female imagery. Even divine imagery doesn't prove matriarchy. It proves symbolism, and symbols don't always map neatly onto power. There's also the issue of fortifications. Early claims that the Minoans didn't build defensive walls led to assumptions out their peacefulness, but Cree's geography may explain much of that. Steep terrain and narrow coastal approaches offered natural protection, and there's evidence that some Minoan settlements were fortified, especially in later periods as the society grew more complex and external threats increased. The idea that the Minoans simply had no need for defense is no longer convincing. Even the story of their decline speaks to violence and instability around 1450. BCE. Minoan sites across Crete show signs of destruction. Fires, collapsed structures, and abandoned buildings mark the end of the palatial era. The Mycenaeans from mainland Greece appear to have moved in adopting and adapting Minoan systems, but asserting their own dominance, whether that transition was conquest, assimilation, or something in between. It wasn't peaceful. So where does that lead the myth? It leaves us with a society that was complex, layered, and still not fully understood. A society with stunning artistic output, advanced engineering, and a central role in Mediterranean trade, but also a society with hierarchy, with power dynamics, with evidence of conflict and control. In other words, human society. The appeal of the peaceful Minoan myth is understandable. It offers a counter-narrative to centuries of mal-dominated, war-driven history. It gives us a glimpse, however speculative, of another possibility. But when we let the myth run too far ahead of the evidence, we risk missing what's truly remarkable about the Minoans. Not that they were perfect, but that they were different enough to challenge our assumptions, even as they remain tethered to the same human complexities found across time. Modern interpretation plays a large role in this. The desire to find a prehistoric civilization that breaks the mold of patriarchy or militarism is strong and often well-meaning, but interpretation has to be grounded in what's actually there. A figurine of a snake-wielding goddess tells us something about ritual and symbolism. It doesn't tell us who held political power or whether peace was the norm. Artifacts must be read carefully, not projected onto. To be clear, this doesn't mean women were unimportant in Minoan society. Far from it. Their prominence in art, the possibility of female religious roles, and the integration of feminine imagery into Minoan culture all point to a society where women were visible and possibly influential. But visibility is not proof of dominance, and reverence is not the same as governance. The myth of the Minoan utopia is ultimately more about us than them. It reflects what we wish the past could offer: a lost paradise, a model for a better future, an ancient society, untainted by the brutalities we see in our own history. But the real Minoans were not mythical. They were people navigating trade, religion, labor, and politics in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. They weren't perfect, they weren't pacifists. They were something more valuable, real, and that reality is rich enough without the fantasy, the paucity. Minoans left behind palaces that functioned as bureaucratic machines, art that spoke across millennia, and a legacy that shaped the cultures that followed them. They gave us glimpses of complexity and contradiction, of beauty and control, of ceremony and struggle. That's the story worth telling. Not because it confirms our ideals, but because it deepens our understanding. And in that depth, we find something more enduring than utopia, a civilization that continues to challenge what we think we know, not just about them, but about the stories. We choose to believe Chapter 9, the guillotine, was invented during the French Revolution, when most people picture the French Revolution. They picture the guillotine, a raised platform in a public square, a blade suspended high above the crowd. A hush, then a crash. It became the defining image of the reign of terror, swift, mechanical, impersonal, a symbol of revolutionary justice or revolutionary bloodlust, depending on where you stood. It's easy to assume the guillotine was invented for that very moment, that it was a product of chaos and violence. Born in the 1790s France to serve the revolution's hunger for executions, but the truth, like many myths tied to dramatic moments in history, is quieter and older. The guillotine wasn't new. It didn't spring from the mind of a radical inventor or a bloodthirsty committee. It was based on technology that had been used for centuries long before Paris erupted in revolt. What changed during the French Revolution wasn't the machine itself, it was the meaning. People assigned to it decapitation devices had existed in Europe since at least the Middle Ages. In England, there was the Halifax gibbet, a large wooden structure with a weighted blade that dropped on a rope. It was used in Yorkshire for centuries, mainly for punishing thieves. In Italy, a similar device called the mania was used for noble executions, and in Germany, the plank or F-bow falling axe had been employed in various regions. Since the 16th century, the basic principle was the same: a blade released from above, delivering a quick death, efficient if not always precise. But none of these devices carried the cultural weight the guillotine would come to bear. They were regional tools tucked away in local histories. What gave the guillotine its fame and infamy was its central role in a revolution that declared itself the champion of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The name itself came not from an inventor but an advocate, Dr. Joseph Ignate Guillotine. He was a physician and a deputy in the National Assembly, and he wasn't a sadist. He was in fact a reformer. In 1789, as the revolution gained momentum, Guillotine proposed a series of legal reforms. One of his most controversial and most misunderstood was the standardization of capital punishment. Before the revolution, how one died in France depended largely on one's class. Nobles were often beheaded by sword, a relatively quick and honorable method. Commoners might be hanged, burned, or broken on the wheels, slow, painful, and public. Guillotine saw this as an affront to the revolutionary ideal of equality before the law. If people were to die for crimes, then they should die the same way regardless of rank. He didn't design the machine that would carry out that vision. That task fell to others, including a surgeon named Antoine Louis and a German bee-born harpsichord maker named Tobias Schmidt, who built the prototype. Guillotine's role was political and philosophical. He argued that a mechanical device would ensure a quick, painless death, a humane and egalitarian form of justice. In an age that claimed to be enlightened, the machine was first tested on animals, then corpses. When it was approved by the National Assembly, it was simply called the machine, or Lazen, after Antoine Louis. But the public, perhaps fueled by rumor or irony, began calling it Lilliton. The name stuck. Guillotine, much to his distress, became permanently linked to a device he hadn't created and would come to dread. He spent the rest of his life trying to distance himself from it. At first, the guillotine was embraced as a symbol of rational justice. It was installed in public squares, its mechanisms maintained with precision. The executions were formal events attended by large crowds, but also overseen by law. There was, for a time, a kind of grim dignity to it. The condemned were allowed last words. The blade was swift, and compared to older methods, torture, burning, drawn-out mutilation, this was seen as progress. But that image didn't last. As the revolution deepened, the guillotine's presence grew more ominous. By 1793, France had entered the Reign of Terror, a period marked by internal purges, paranoia, and rapid trials. The guillotine became an almost daily fixture in Paris, cutting down enemies of the Republic, both real and imagined. Revolutionary leaders like Danton and Robespierre, who once defended its use, would eventually fall under its blade. Numbers vary, but during the height of the terror, thousands were executed. In Paris alone, the Place de Revel, where the guillotine stood, saw a steady stream of bodies. The line between justice and spectacle blurred. Heads were shown to the crowd. Executioners became minor celebrities. The machine that had been meant to humanize death now symbolized mass repression, and yet its design never changed. The blade remained the same. What changed was the context. The guillotine didn't become terrifying because of how it worked. It became terrifying because of how it was used, and how often it was never the machine alone. It was the politics, the speed, the frenzy of accusations, and the relentless certainty of the state after the revolution. The guillotine didn't disappear. It remained France's primary method of execution for nearly 2 centuries. It was still considered the most humane form of capital punishment, and its use continued well into the modern era. In fact, the last execution by guillotine in France took place in 1977, long after most people imagined it had been retired. To history, that longevity complicates the myth. The guillotine wasn't just a relic of the Revolution. It was an enduring tool quietly used even as its image remained frozen in the 1790s, a blade in motion operating long after the crowds had dispersed. So why does the myth persist? Why do we still think of it as a sudden invention of revolutionary terror? Because history likes a sharp image. The guillotine offered one both literal and symbolic. It was clean, dramatic, easy to remember. It turned abstract ideas like justice and equality into steel and wood, and over time, that symbolism outgrew the truth. Dr. Guillotine's original vision, a humane, impartial method of execution, was swallowed by the spectacle that followed. The guillotine stands as a reminder of how tools, no matter their purpose, can be transformed by the forces around them. What begins as reform can turn into repression. What starts as progress can become fear, not because the idea was flawed, but because the moment reshaped it. The myth of the guillotine's invention during the Revolution isn't just about a misunderstanding of dates or mechanics. It's about how we interpret symbols, how we assign blame or meaning to things that outlive their context. Guillotine wanted a better way to die. History gave him a reputation. He never thought the machine was meant to reduce suffering in the wrong hands. It became an icon of cruelty, and that perhaps is the lesson. Even the most well-intentioned instruments can become something else entirely depending on who uses them and why. Chapter 10. Julius Caesar was killed by a betrayal of 60 senators all at once. The scene is iconic. Julius Caesar walks calmly into the Senate, unaware of what's coming. 60 senators in flowing robes close and draw their hidden daggers. And strike as one among them is Brutus, Caesar's trusted ally, delivering the final devastating blow. The dictator falls silently, his blood pooling at the feet of a marble statue. The Republic avenged. That's the story, at least the version etched into Western imagination by Shakespeare paintings and textbooks. A tidy narrative, betrayal, hubris, justice, all wrapped into a single moment, but history rarely unfolds that cleanly. Assassination of Julius Caesar was not a well-choreographed coup. It wasn't a sudden synchronized betrayal by 60 men moving in unison. It was messier, more desperate, and in some ways far more human. By the time Caesar entered the theater, Pompey, on the Ides of March 154 BCE, was not a man caught off guard. He was a man who had already been warned the night before. His wife, Calpurnia, had begged him not to go. She'd had a disturbing dream full of blood and portents. Friends and allies had urged caution. One senator even slipped him a written warning. As he made his way through the crowd, omens, letters, whispers. Caesar wasn't lacking information. What he lacked was fear, or maybe trust. He chose to go anyway. Some say he believed too much in his own invincibility. Others think he calculated the risk and decided that staying away would show weakness. Either way, he arrived at the Senate meeting that day with his usual confidence, unaware only of the exact moment the blade would fall, not the danger itself. The meeting wasn't held in the Senate's usual home. That building was under renovation, so the gathering took place in the curia of the theater of Pompey, a public complex not far from the heart of Rome. The conspirators had arranged everything carefully. They surrounded him with friendly faces. Some of his closest companions were in on the plot. Among them were Cassius, a hardened senator and longtime critic of Caesar's power, and Brutus, whose involvement would later give the murder its most tragic flavor. But while the conspiracy had dozens of backers, perhaps as many as 60, it wasn't a synchronized attack. Most of those involved were part of the planning, not the physical violence. When the moment came, the stabbing was chaotic. Accounts say it began with a distraction. Someone approached Caesar with a petition. As he waved it away, another conspirator grabbed his toga. That was the signal. The first knife struck, then came another and another. In total, Caesar received 23 stab wounds, but not all were lethal. Many were shallow, hesitant, imprecise, suggesting a scene less like a surgical strike and more like a crowded frenzy. The final blow may have come from behind. Ancient sources note that only one wound to the chest would have been fatal on its own. What happened in that room wasn't a poetic betrayal. It was a group of men panicking through a crime they believed was necessary, but feared to commit in the tight space of the Curia amid the marble and echoes. Blades flashed and hands trembled. Some conspirators may have wounded each other in the confusion, and then there's the line at two brute, the moment that turned. Brutus, from friend to eternal symbol of betrayal, it's powerful. Shakespeare's phrasing gave the moment an emotional punch that history alone never could, but there's no reliable ancient source confirming that Caesar said it. Suetonius, writing about a century after the event, suggested Caesar may have said "Kesu teknon" in Greek. You too, my child, but even that is speculation. Plutarch, another major source, said Caesar died in silence. What's more likely is that he died in shock and pain, surrounded by men he had once considered allies. He bled at the base of a statue of Pompey, his old rival, an unplanned but haunting detail. And when the blood dried and the conspirators slipped away, Rome was left not with clarity, but confusion. The assassination was meant to save the Republic. Instead, it accelerated its collapse. The conspirators assumed that with Caesar gone, the Senate would regain its authority, but the people didn't see it that way. Caesar had been immensely popular. He brought wealth to Rome, distributed land, and forgave debts. He was the face of stability in a city torn by years of civil war. His murder didn't feel like justice to many. It felt like treachery. Within weeks, the city tipped into crisis. Within months, new alliances formed, and within a few years, Caesar's adopted heir Octavian, later Augustus, would become the first emperor of Rome. Consolidating more power than Caesar ever held, the assassins hadn't restored the Republic. They'd written its final chapter. So why does the myth of the synchronized betrayal by 60 senators endure? Because it makes sense. It has symmetry. A great man rises too far too fast. His peers strike him down. His closest friend delivers the final blow. The Republic is avenged. Is the kind of story that works on stage and sculpture in the classroom. It simplifies motive, compresses action, and gives the moment a clear emotional arc. But the real story doesn't need embellishment. It's powerful because of its complexity, not in spite of it. Caesar was no innocent, and the senators were not mindless villains. It was a clash of ideals, ambitions, and fears. The act wasn't clean. It wasn't even fully planned. It was desperate. When we reduce history to legend, we lose that messiness. We lose the humanity understanding. What really happened on the Ides of March doesn't take away from the gravity of the event. It adds to it. It reminds us that even history's most famous deaths don't happen in slow motion. They happen in crowded rooms with tension, with panic, with people who hesitate. And that may be the most enduring lesson. Not that Caesar was betrayed by 60 men at once, but that history often chooses the version that fits best, not the one that's hardest to face, because the truth is rarely as tidy as the myth, but it's always worth hearing. Chapter 11. The Titanic sank because it hit an iceberg. The story is familiar. A cold night in April 1912, the largest, most luxurious ship in the world glides through the North Atlantic. Lookout spots an iceberg too late. There's a sharp jolt. Metal scrapes against ice. Water floods in. Within hours, the Titanic, the so-called unsinkable ship, is gone. Over 1,500 lives lost in a single night. A tragic encounter with nature. An unlucky twist of fate. That's the version most people know. A clean story. Cause and effect. One iceberg, one ship, one disaster. But the real story of the Titanic sinking isn't that simple. Yes, the iceberg was real. It tore open the ship's hull and triggered the sequence of events that followed. But it wasn't the only cause, not by a long shot. The iceberg was the final blow in a long chain of decisions, flaws, and failures. The Titanic didn't sink just because it struck ice. It sank because it was already vulnerable. What happened that night is better understood not as a single error, but as a cascade, a system under pressure, weakened by its own design, its materials, and its assumptions, a series of small cracks that became one enormous break. Let's start with the steel. The Titanic was built in Belfast, a marvel of Edgeworthian engineering, but the steel used in its construction was brittle by today's standards, especially in cold temperatures. Modern metallurgical analysis shows that the steel contained high levels of sulfur and phosphorus, which made it more prone to fracture rather than bend. That alone didn't doom the ship. But it meant that when the iceberg struck, the steel didn't deform, it shattered. Then there were the rivets more. Then 3 million of them held the Titanic together. Many were made of iron, not steel, and in critical areas, particularly near the bow, the quality of those rivets was substandard under stress. They popped. Investigations later suggested that when the iceberg scraped along the hull, these rivets failed rapidly, letting water pour in at a speed the ship couldn't handle. There was also a fire deep in one of the coal bunkers. A slow-burning fire had been smoldering for days. Possibly even before the ship left Southampton. Cold fires weren't uncommon in steamships at the time, but this one may have done more than burn fuel. It was located near the very side of the hull where the iceberg struck. Some researchers now believe the fire weakened the steel from within, making that section more susceptible to damage. It didn't cause the collision, but it may have made the results far worse. Add to this the ship's design. Celebrated, but not infallible, Titanic's hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments. The idea was that even if several filled with water, the ship would stay afloat, but the design had a catch. The walls between compartments didn't go all the way up, they stopped just above the waterline. So as water filled the front compartments, it spilled over into the next. Like water moving through a tilted ice cube tray, the ship didn't need to be ripped open from end to end. A long gash along the starboard side was enough. Then there were the warnings. Throughout the day and evening of April 14th, the Titanic received multiple messages from nearby ships, reporting dense ice in the area. Some warnings were acknowledged, others were not. One message was reportedly never delivered to the bridge because the wireless operators under pressure to handle passenger messages were overwhelmed. They were busy sending telegrams, not safety reports. Even the speed of the ship was part of the problem, despite the ice warnings. Titanic continued at near full speed. This was not entirely reckless by the standards of the day's steam. Ships often maintained speed in icy waters, but it was a risk, a calculated one. The belief was that the ship was sturdy enough to handle whatever came. That belief didn't hold, and then came the lifeboats. Titanic carried just 20, enough for about half the people on board. This wasn't illegal. Maritime safety laws at the time hadn't kept up with the size of ships. The assumption was that lifeboats would shuttle passengers to rescue ships, not serve as standalone survival vessels. That assumption proved fatally optimistic. The Carpathia, the ship that eventually rescued survivors, was hours away. Even worse, many of the lifeboats that did launch left half-empty. Confusion, poor training, and disbelief that the ship was really sinking led to delays and miscommunication. First-class passengers were prioritized. Many crew members didn't know how many could safely be loaded into a lifeboat. Some were terrified the boats would break under too much weight. In the end, hundreds died, not just because of a lack of lifeboats, but because the lifeboats that existed were not fully used. Put all of this together, and the iceberg starts to look less like the main character and more like the final line in a long script. Titanic was vulnerable before it ever struck ice. Its materials had weaknesses. Its design had blind spots. Its crew was underprepared for disaster. Its operators dismissed risk in favor of reputation. It carried more people than it could save, and it moved ahead under the assumption that it didn't need to worry. It's no surprise the iceberg got the blame. Icebergs are clean, they're visible, external, easy to point to a force of nature, not a failure of design or judgment. But nature wasn't the only force at work. Human choices shaped the disaster long before the North Atlantic got involved. And yet the myth endures. The ship hit an iceberg. It sank. End of story. That version appeals to us because it's neat. It's easier to process than a cascade of technical flaws and organizational missteps. A single blow feels tragic but comprehensible. A long chain of preventable errors feels uncomfortable, especially when so many of them were rooted in human overconfidence. Titanic was built in an age of immense technological optimism. It represented progress, luxury, mastery over the natural world. It was hailed as unsinkable, a word that seems almost cruel in retrospect. The irony is thick, which makes the story even more irresistible. But the real lessons from Titanic lie not in irony or fate, they lie in Systems in the ways that failures accumulate in how multiple small decisions, each reasonable in isolation, can add up to catastrophe. That's what makes Titanic so instructive. Not just as a maritime disaster, but as a case. Studying how complex failures happen, because disasters rarely have a single cause, they have layers, some visible, some buried. And when they collapse, they do so all at once, not because of one bad decision, but because of many decisions that failed to account for the full picture. The iceberg was the trigger, but the Titanic was already primed to break. Remembering that doesn't make history less powerful. It makes it more meaningful. It reminds us that behind every sudden disaster is often a slow drift towards vulnerability, that prevention requires seeing the whole system, not just the final crack, and that real understanding of any failure means looking past the obvious answer. Chapter 12. The Crusades were a noble defensive war. The image is familiar: armored knights cloaked in red crosses marching east under banners of faith, a righteous army leaving Christian Europe to reclaim the Holy Land from foreign invaders, a mission of piety, sacrifice, and divine justice. Noble warriors defending their religion, their homeland, and their God. That's the version many people were taught. And it's not entirely false, but it is deeply incomplete, because the Crusades, as they actually happened, were not clean campaigns of spiritual defense. They were sprawling, brutal, and politically tangled wars fought over centuries, and they reveal far more about human ambition than divine purpose. It's true that the First Crusade began with a call to arms by Pope Urban II in 1095. Speaking to a crowd at Clermont in France, he urged Christians to take up arms and march to Jerusalem, claiming that Christians in the East were under attack by Muslim forces and that the sacred city had fallen into the wrong hands. But his appeal wasn't just about defense. It was about unity, rallying fractured European nobles under one, because it was about papal authority expanding Rome's influence in a volatile political landscape. And it was about salvation. Urban promised spiritual rewards, the forgiveness of sins for those who fought and died in the name of Christ. That message landed hard, not just with knights, but with peasants, adventurers, and opportunists. Some genuinely believed they were doing God's work. Others saw a chance for land, wealth, or status. The result wasn't a single disciplined force, but a chaotic surge of armed groups, many with no plan beyond reaching the east and shedding blood. Even before reaching Jerusalem, the First Crusade turned violent, not against Muslims, but against Jews, in what became known as the People's Crusade. Mobs of crusaders swept through the Rhineland, slaughtering Jewish communities. In cities like Mainz and Worms, these massacres weren't commanded from above. They were carried out by groups, driven by a toxic mix of religious zeal and scapegoating for them. Journey toward the Holy Land began with butchering unarmed neighbors. When the main Crusader armies finally reached Jerusalem in 1099, they laid siege to the city, then stormed it. What followed was a massacre. Christian chroniclers of the time described the blood flowing in the streets. Muslims and Jews were both slaughtered. It wasn't a surgical liberation. It was total war, and that was just the beginning. Over the next few centuries, crusading became institutionalized, not just as a religious cause, but as a tool of power. There were crusades in the Holy Land, yes, but also in the Baltic, in Spain, and within Europe itself. The targets weren't always Muslims. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, not against an external enemy, but against a group of Christian heretics in southern France known as the Cathars. That campaign became a full-blown civil war. Towns were wiped out whole. Populations were put to the sword. When asked how to distinguish heretics from faithful Christians during the siege, a papal leotard is said to have replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Then came the Fourth Crusade, a disaster that stripped away whatever moral clarity the movement had left. In 1204, instead of reaching the Holy Land, crusaders diverted to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a Christian city. They ransacked its churches, were looted art and relics, were stolen. Citizens were raped and murdered. The Crusaders installed their own emperor and claimed victory not over Islam, but over fellow Christians. It was supposed to be a holy mission. It ended in one of the most infamous acts of Christian-on-Christian violence in history. Over time, the goals of the Crusades shifted constantly. Some campaigns were launched to defend vulnerable kingdoms in the East. Others were opportunistic land grabs. Some crusaders went with high ideals, others joined for personal gain. Monarchs used the Crusades to boost their prestige, popes used them too. Centralized control nobles used them to solve internal disputes by sending rivals away to war in many cases. The lines between faith, greed, politics, and survival were completely blurred. There were moments of genuine courage and tragedy. There were also betrayals, forced conversion, slavery, and cycles of vengeance. The Crusades weren't a single story, they were a series of stories overlapping, conflicting, and often contradictory. And yet the myth persists that the Crusades were primarily noble, that they were defensive, that they were justified, clean and necessary. Why? Because the myth is simple. It offers a moral framework. Christian knights fighting for what was theirs, resisting invaders, standing firm for faith. It works well in textbook speeches and nationalist memory. It's easier to teach than the long, uneven truth. But that truth matters because when we oversimplify the past, we distort it, and in the case of the Crusades, those distortions have lasting consequences. The memory of the Crusades has been used again and again to frame religious conflict in Europe, in the Middle East, and Middle East. Beyond, it's been invoked to justify wars, define identities, and draw boundaries. But those uses are built not on clarity, but on legend. If we look at the Crusades as they really were, what we see is a series of wars shaped by belief, yes, but also by ambition, fear, and the shifting tides of power. We see a movement that changed over time, driven by people with wildly different motives, and we see that even the most sacred causes can become vehicles for some of humanity's darkest impulses. To be clear, this isn't about assigning blame to one side or the other. Muslim armies also committed atrocities. Political opportunism was not a uniquely Christian flaw, but the idea that the Crusades were only about righteous defense ignores too much. It ignores the greed, the infighting, the massacres of civilians. The Crusades were not a single war with a single purpose. They were a long, complex chapter in a much larger human story, one where religion, politics, and identity collided in ways that still echo today. Understanding that complexity doesn't take away from the faith of those who believed they were doing the right thing. It doesn't erase the courage of people who fought or the suffering of those who died. What it does is remind us that history is never as simple as a flag and a cause, and that matters because when we mistake myth for memory, we lose the chance to learn. We risk repeating the worst parts, wrapped in the illusion of moral clarity. The Crusades were real. So was the blood they spilled, the cultures they collided with, and the legacies they left. They weren't holy wars in the way we often remember them. They were human wars, messy, motivated, and full of contradiction. That truth may be harder to tell, but it's worth hearing. Chapter 13. Einstein believed in quantum physics. It's easy to imagine Einstein as the ultimate father figure of modern physics. The wild hair, the chalkboard equations, the quiet smile behind profound thoughts. We associate him with the theory of relativity, of course, but many also credit him with inventing quantum physics, or at least being one of its champions. After all, didn't he win the Nobel Prize for work that helped launch quantum theory? Didn't his discoveries open the door to it? They did. And yet the story doesn't end there, because while Einstein's early ideas helped birth quantum mechanics, he never truly embraced what it became. In fact, he spent much of his later life pushing back against it, not out of stubbornness, not out of ignorance, but because he couldn't reconcile himself with a vision of the universe where chance, not law, ruled the deepest level of reality. Einstein helped light the match, but he didn't like the fire it started. In 1905, at the age of 26, Einstein published a series of papers that would reshape physics. One of them, perhaps the least flashy at the time, dealt with something called the photoelectric effect. He showed that when light hits certain metals, it can eject electrons. But here's the twist: the energy of those electrons didn't depend on the brightness of the light, as classical physics would predict, but on its frequency, its color. So to speak, to explain this, Einstein proposed that light wasn't just a wave, but could act like particles, discrete packets of energy, later called photons. It was a radical idea, and it laid the groundwork for quantum theory by suggesting that energy comes in chunks, not smooth flows. That insight won him the Nobel Prize in 1921, but it also pulled physics toward a strange new world, a world where matter and energy behaved unpredictably, where particles could act like waves, and waves like particles where certainty dissolved into probability. And that's where Einstein began to pull away as quantum mechanics evolved through the 1920s. A new generation of physicists, Niels Bohr, Heisenberg, Elvin Schrödinger, and others, built a theory that was breathtaking in its predictive power, but unsettling in its implications. The famous uncertainty principle said you couldn't know both a particle's position and momentum, precisely the Copenhagen interpretation favored by Bohr, claiming that physical systems don't have definite properties until they're measured, and even then the outcome is fundamentally probabilistic. The math could tell you what might happen, but not what will happen to Einstein. This was a problem, a deep philosophical problem. He believed the universe should be orderly, that beneath every surface there ought to be clarity, cause, and rule. He once said, God does not play dice with the universe. It wasn't a rejection of randomness in everyday life. It was a rejection of randomness as the foundation of reality. He didn't like the idea that observation could change the thing being observed, or that the laws of physics could be fundamentally incomplete. In private letters and public debates, Einstein made his discomfort known. His most famous intellectual sparring partner was Niels Bohr. The two giants clashed repeatedly at conferences in the 1920s and 30s, especially at the SV conferences in Brussels. Einstein would present thought experiments designed to show the contradictions or gaps in quantum theory. Bohr, often with Heisenberg at his side, would respond, sometimes with counterexamples, sometimes with philosophical arguments, sometimes with silence. One of Einstein's most important critiques came in 1935 alongside Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen. He published what's now known as the EPR paradox. They proposed a scenario in which two particles once linked could remain connected even when separated by vast distances. A feature called entanglement, measuring one particle, would instantaneously affect the state of the other, no matter how far apart they were. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance. It violated everything he believed about locality, the idea that objects can only be influenced by their immediate surroundings. The EPR paper wasn't an attack from outside the field. It was a challenge from within, a demand for a better, deeper explanation. Einstein wasn't denying the predictions of quantum theory. He was questioning whether it was the complete story. He believed there must be hidden variables, unknown factors that would restore determinism and remove the mystery. Decades later, experiments inspired by EPR would be carried out most famously by physicists John Bell and others in the 1960s and 70s. The results were surprising. They showed that the kind of local realism Einstein hoped for, the idea that distant events couldn't instantly influence each other, didn't match what nature was doing. Entanglement was real. The spooky part wasn't a bug in the theory. It was a feature of reality Einstein didn't live to see those results. He died in 1955, still convinced that quantum mechanics, while useful, was incomplete. He worked to the end, trying to unify physics to create a single theory that would tie together gravity, electromagnetism, and quantum behavior. He never found it, but the questions he asked shaped the road others would take. It's important to say that Einstein wasn't anti-science. He didn't oppose quantum physics out of pride or nostalgia. He helped build it. He understood it deeply. His objections were not about equations. They were about meaning. What kind of universe do we live in? He asked if chance governs the foundation of everything. Is that knowledge? Is that science? Or is it a sign that we haven't looked deeply enough? That tension between predictive power and philosophical clarity still animates physics today. Quantum mechanics works. It powers your computer, your phone, your GPS. It explains chemical reactions, radioactive decay, and the structure of atoms. But the interpretation of what it means continues to evolve, and that conversation started in many ways with Einstein's refusal to be satisfied. So the myth that Einstein was the father of quantum physics and fully supported it doesn't capture the complexity of his role. He was a founder, yes, but also a skeptic, a believer in order, not uncertainty, a man who helped open the door, then spent decades peering through it and asking if what he saw made sense, and maybe that's the deeper legacy. Not just the equations, but the questions, not just the progress, but the resistance that sharpened its science advances not only through answers, but through persistent doubt, through minds that ask again and again whether we've reached the bottom or just the next layer. Einstein didn't reject science, he asked it to go further. He didn't deny quantum mechanics, he challenged it to explain itself, and in doing so, he made it stronger. Sometimes shaping the future of an idea means not embracing it, but pressing hard against its limits. Einstein gave quantum physics both its early light and its longest shadow, and in that tension the field found its way forward.